Welcome to Connecting with Nature. Today we're going to talk about planting trees, how important trees are to the environment. I'll give you 24 reasons of why you should plant trees, but some of them are less known, like for instance, some of the chemicals given off by the conifers. So today we're going to we're going to just concentrate on coniferous trees. These are trees that usually have needles that keep them all winter, and they have cones. And some of these cones you can see are different shaped. Some are very small, like the hemlock here. Pines have larger cones. So from anywhere from a little cone like this to a large cone like that. And we'll cover the 18 species of coniferous trees in the area. We're here at Scout Valley, right within the city of Aurelia, and we will cover most of the 18 species without even going outside the town limits. So let's start on our tour of conifer trees and covering 18 coniferous trees. We're now in the trails in Scout Valley, and I made this little booklet up of conifer trees in the area. Just some of the cutting of the forest, how we cut the forest over the years and then decided we needed to put some of the trees back. Today we're concentrating on the 18 coniferous trees. I have a key here putting them into different groups. The first group are the cedars and the junipers. The second group, the larches. Third group, flat needles in two rows like the balsam fir, eastern hemlock, and Canada yew. Last two groups are the spruce and the pines. Beside me here I have a small tree, and you can see it's got cones on it, so it's a conifer. And this one, the needles are very flat and small, millimeters overlapping. And notice how the whole branch is flat. This is the eastern white cedar. Eastern white cedars are good for landscaping. They like wet areas, dry areas. Actually the tree of life. They have vitamin C, so you can boil the bark and make an emulsion. So eastern white cedar is a beautiful conifer in our area, and an easy to grow one. Here we have another tree with small needles that are scaly and overlapping. You can see how small the needles are and how they overlap. This is an eastern red cedar, a beautiful tree, and it gets little cones on it, looks like berries. The interesting thing about eastern red cedar is it's got these scaly overlapping ones we just saw, but also on the young growth, small tree like this, you have these sharp spines. Sometimes you can see both the older growth and the younger growth on the same tree, like this tree behind us here. If we look, the end branches have the sharp, and other branches further down have the scaly overlapping needles. So eastern red cedar usually grows in an open area. See a lot of them on hydro corridors. So we have eastern white cedar and eastern red cedar. One more in that group is the common juniper. We'll go look for that species now. The last species in this group is the common juniper. Common juniper have these sharp little needles, and also gets a cone. You can see they're green at first and then they turn blue. The cone looks like a little berry, and they're used to flavor some of gin and some alcoholic beverages. So this is called Juniper's communis variety depressa. You can see it grows small, it spreads over, usually less than a couple meters tall. and gets into open areas, sometimes quite invasive, crowding out other plants. You can see the eastern red cedar behind here that's quite a bit taller than the juniper, but the juniper is infringing on habitat of the eastern red cedar. So that's our first group, the eastern white cedar, the eastern red cedar, and the common juniper. We're now in the part of Scout Valley with the tall eastern hemlock trees. You can see towering above all other trees, and hemlocks are wonderful trees. They're in that group of conifers that have flat needles in two rows on either side of the branch. So you can see the needles are flat here and in two rows. So they actually twist to get into two rows, and you can see the small cones here at the end of the hemlock. Now the hemlock branches, the needles are only about 1 centimeter long and very white glaucous underneath. This stomata, where it gets the holes where the sunlight and the air comes in, are quite glaucous underneath, and you'll see when we compare them to the other two in this group how smaller and whiter they look underneath. So the eastern hemlock is really an important tree that is used for timbers and barns, and also we're going to look at a place where the old hemlock stump acts as a potting plant for two other species, the yellow birch and the American beech. Yellow birch really like to use old hemlock stumps to set their seeds down. They have a hard time setting seeds. Old hemlock stumps work perfectly for them. Hemlock stump has used, it doesn't deteriorate well, so it's got real rich humus, and two species have taken advantage of that. First, the yellow birch here have set roots down in the old hemlock stump, as well as the American beech here. Unfortunately, the American beech is dead now from beech bark disease, but both those species have used the old hemlock stump. We have another tree here beside us that have flat needles, you can see, in two rows. And if we just take a twig off of just the end off that and look at it, you can see it's quite a bit larger. It's 2 centimeters long, the eastern hemlock, or 1. And if you look underneath, it doesn't have that glaucous underside that the hemlock has. The hemlock also has these little stems. The eastern hemlock right there. This one here, if we pull one of them off, it has a disc attachment. So it's got a disc at the base, like all firs have, and this is balsam fir. So we have the balsam fir here, and the eastern hemlock here. There's one more that we need to find, is the Canada yew, that looks very similar. So we'll go looking for the Canada yew now and complete that group. We've come up the trail a little ways, and now we're seeing stands of this conifer. Again, it's got those flat needles in rows. At first it looks a bit like balsam fir, but the needles aren't quite as long, 1.5 centimeters long, but longer than the hemlock. But the big thing with these, so if we take a couple off, you can see it's got a peg attachment, not a stem like the hemlock, not a disc like the balsam fir, and also the underside has no white sheen like the hemlock or the white line like the balsam fir. It's all green underneath. And this is called Canada yew. Canada yew has a chemical in it called taxus that's been used for cancer research. They clip the ends of the branches and boil that down to get the taxus out of it, which they use to treat cancers. The First Nations people have been hired on a contract to collect Canada yew for cancer research. A beautiful little shrub that gets somewhat unnoticed because it never gets more than a meter high as it spreads in the forest understory. And at first people think it's hemlock or balsam fir, but the big thing to look at are the needles. Look how the needles are pointed. They have a pointed tip at the end, not rounded like the balsam fir and the hemlock, but a very pointed tip. So that completes this group of the flat needles in two rows, the balsam fir, the eastern hemlock, and the Canada yew. We're going to talk about deciduous coniferous trees now. These are trees that lose their needles in the fall. They turn a golden color and drop to the ground. Then they grow them back in the spring. And this is our first one. And you can see the needles are in bunches of 12 to 15 for this species, very small cones. This is called the American larch or the tamarack. It has different names depending on First Nations. They use this tree a lot. They use the roots for their birch bark canoe to tie the roots together. Although black spruce also was stronger and worked well for tying the sheets of birch bark for their canoes. So this is an eastern tamarack, eastern larch or a tamarack tree. We're now along a fence row here, and we're going to finish off the third group of conifers, those deciduous coniferous. We saw the tamarack, or the American larch. And along here we have the European larch, an imported tree that's been planted with the bigger cones. So you can see how big the cones are for the European larch here, where the American larch have very small cones. It also loses its needles, turn golden in the fall and fall. So European larch have been imported from Europe and planted along fence rows and in drier areas, not so much in wet areas where the tamarack. So that includes the larch group. We're standing beside a younger tree here. This is, I would call it the king of the conifers. And if we look at these needles, they're in bundles. See how they're round and they're all in bundles. In this particular one, we will just separate it out and see how many needles in the bundle. And there we go. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or WHITE, the white pine. This is the eastern white pine. This is the tree that opened up this area for logging. These long, straight timbers were shipped back to England for shipmast during the Napoleonic Wars. Very important. If you ruled the sea, you ruled the world. And they had cut all their large timber over there. So these eastern white pines were a real bonus. And as you look through the landscape, you can see this smaller tree, but if the eastern white pine will tower above other trees in the horizon. And we see a large eastern white pine there, some smaller ones coming up. So the king of the conifers, the eastern white pine. Now there's, to the left, there's another tree I see just to the left on the horizon. It's a scrubbier tree, and it is an introduced tree, and we'll go down and look at that closer. We've come down the hill, and now we're standing beside this smaller pine, quite a bit different. The eastern white pine has these long cones with large scales, but what we're looking at now are smaller cones like this one, and you see how they come back on the branch. They're reflexed. They're small at first, and then they open up into sharp scales. Above us, over our head, there's a cone there, and you can see how it's reflects back on the branch. And I have a couple of branches here of the Scotch pine, and there's the cone, the young cones that's just developing at the end, and you can see they're reflects backwards to the base of the branch. And here's a larger cone that's starting to open. We know this is a Scotch pine because if we take a bundle, there again, needles in a bundle, and see how they're twisted together. They're twisted close to each other in bundles of two. There's another pine we're going to look at next that has bundles of two. The needles are a little longer and are a little shorter than the Scotch pine, and they form a V. That's the Jack pine. So this is an introduced species of pine that was brought over from Europe, mainly from Scotland, and planted here by M&Rs in the 1960s and 70s. The idea was to make them for Christmas trees. However, they tend to go gnarly when they get older. Somehow the genetic variety we got tends to get crooked branches once they get older. So not a great wildlife value tree, the Scotch pine, and probably should never have been planted like it was in big numbers here in Ontario. We're standing beside another tree very similar to the last pine we saw, the Scotch pine, but this one, you notice the cones are not reflexed back, but are flexed along the branch. And as you go up, you can see the small cones coming out for this year forming up. They're along the branch, not reflexed back like the Scotch pine. Also, the needles here, if we just pick a needle and put it here, look how it's shorter than the Jack pine, the Scotch pine needles, and they're in the shape of a V. These are twisted around each other together. These form a V for the Jack pine. So the needles along the cones along the branch, and the needles in the form of a V for Scotch pine. Otherwise, very similar to the Scotch pine, the Jack pine. Jack pines need heat to release the seeds in the cones. So after a fire in the north, this is one of the first species that come in along with the black spruce. This tree is another important tree when settlers first come over. This is the red pine, and like the white pine, was used for timber. We see some of the cones have fallen on the ground here. So with red pine, it's quite different than the white pine. The needles are in bundles, this time with two. So we had the Scotch pine in bundles of two, and we had the Jack pine in bundles of two. The Jack pine was short and formed a V. The Scotch pines were long, but not this long. The big thing is how you tell a Scotch pine from a red pine. If you take a needle like this, and the red pine, if I bend this, it'll snap quickly in half. In Scotch pine, it doesn't do that. It can't snap quickly in half like a red pine. So the red pine tree was an important tree in eastern North America and still used for logging operations. We are downtown Aurelia now, in urban street area. And the last pine we're going to talk about is the Austrian pine. The Austrian pine is brought over from Europe and planted here. It's a good street tree because it's pollution tolerant, it's drought tolerant, and the big thing is, if we will look over there, they're a short, round crown, so it doesn't get up into the utility wires like an eastern white pine would. So a tree that does well in the city, it has it can do without water, it can surpass all the exhaust fumes that we get in cities. And you can see they've been planted. You'd be amazed if you drive through Aurelia how many Austrian pines are planted along the roadways. Let's just walk across and look at that Austrian pine a little closer. Here we are under the Austrian pine. You can see how large the cones are. Those have opened up now. And you can also see how long the needles are, and they're quite blunt. And the big thing with these is, let's see if we can snap it like we could. See, it doesn't snap. So the imported pines, like the Scotch pine, the Austrian pine, don't snap like the red pine. We're in a wetland area along county line, and right on the edge we have a conifer here, and if we look at the end of it, we can see it's got needles that are sort of diamond shaped. They don't grow easily like the pines, so they're diamond shaped or squared, and so that means that they're in the spruce group. We have 5 species in the spruce group. The most common one is white spruce, and if we take these needles, crush them, you get a pungent odor like cat urine or skunk smell, a very pungent odor. So the white spruce gives you that pungent odor. That's one of our 5 in the spruce group. Just a little more in the wetland. It's a bit damper here. We have another conifer tree, and if we look at this one, it's quite a bit different than the white spruce. Notice the needles are a little shorter, and the big thing is, if you have a hand lens and you look at them under magnification, you can see the hair is very hairy. I don't know if we can pick that up with the camera, where it's smooth on the white spruce. Red spruce and black spruce have hairy twigs, and white spruce have smooth twigs. The big thing with the black spruce is if we take one and we crush it like we did, let's see if we get that skunk odor. What we get is a pine sol cleaner smell, a nice sweeter smell, more like pine sol cleaner, not the skunky odor of the cat urine from the white spruce. Just before we leave the white spruce and the black spruce, we saw how they had different smells. There's one more spruce that have short needles. Very difficult to find in Simcoe County is the red spruce. I got these in Algonquin Park. I couldn't find any here, but if you take needles from those, they look the same, the triangular needles, and you smell them. It smells like orange peel, kind of a citrus smell. So you get a citrus smell from the red spruce, you get a pine sol smell, pine sol cleaner smell from the black spruce, and you get a cat urine smell from the white spruce. We have a couple of large spruce trees right here in an urban setting, and as soon as I see those tan color cones hanging down, I know it's got to be an introduced spruce. All our native spruce have chestnut or brown, dark brown cones. The only ones with tan are the two introduced ones. The one we see here, the Norway spruce, and the next one we're going to look at, the Colorado blue spruce, both introduced species to this area. Norway spruce have branches that sort of drape and the cones as well hang down, so the whole thing sort of droops on the branches. We'll go up to this Norway spruce and take a closer look. There's the drooping branches that we talked about, and if we just take some needles from one of these branches and crush them like we do for spruce, what we get is a nice Christmassy smell. It's not got a citrus smell or a pine soles cleaner smell or a cat urine smell, but a nice Christmas smell that you would expect pine trees to have. Spruce have a nice long cones that we saw drooping down. That's characteristic. They've got one of the longest cones of all the spruce and of any conifer actually. We have another tree here that a spruce that has tan colored cones, so right away we know it's an introduced species, and this one is on a front lawn, used a lot for landscaping. This is the Colorado blue spruce, usually native to southwestern North America, and has been planted here as a landscape tree. We'll go up and take a closer look at this one. The Colorado blue spruce can have a glaucous white sheen to it like this one, but some can be actually green. And the cones are very interesting, tan, but look quite different than the Norway spruce, where they have a jagged edge to the scales of the cone. Colorado blue spruce are called Pisces pungens because pungens means sharp. Look how sharp these needles are. You can't really crush them well. It hurts your hands. So Colorado blue spruce has been brought up from the States and planted here as a landscape tree. Does very well in an urban setting because it's drought tolerant and pollution tolerant as well.